Hello! In this video, I'm gonna talk about the Robotic Enterprise Framework, or the REFramework. The REFramework is a project template provided by UiPath based on state machines. It is created to fit all of the best practices regarding logging, exception handling, application initialization, and others, being focused on tackling complex business scenarios. For this demo, we're going to use the second practice exercise from the UiPath Developer Advanced course, available in the UiPath Partner Portal. So, let's go to the workflow. The REFramework is generally divided in two parts, the dispatcher and the performer. The dispatcher is in charge of populating some storage application, like an orchestrator queue or maybe an Excel spreadsheet, with the transactions that need to be processed. The performer is in charge of getting each transaction in this storage and then processing it. I'll start by the dispatcher. So, you can see here that I have my dispatcher using the REFramework template, and by default it comes with these four states here: the initialization, the get transaction data, the process transaction, and also the final state, that is the end process. Also, the REFramework is composed of many invoked workflows. Some of them are already created by default, and others need to be created manually. This helps to keep the code clean and easy to maintain. Each of these workflows handle different parts of the entire process. Finally, every REFramework templates come by default with this Excel spreadsheet here inside the data folder called config.xlsx. The purpose of this config file is to keep all variables and configurations used throughout the workflow in a single source, so that every update in these variables or configurations are automatically made here in the workflow as well, so that we don't have to lose time updating them in each one of these states. Okay, so I will open the config file, and inside it we can see here we have three tabs: the settings, constants, and assets. So the settings tab is supposed to hold all the variables used throughout the workflow. So for instance, in the second exercise we are using here, we have the orchestrator queue name to be used to store the transactions. Okay. We also have the acme1 URL, the website URL, and also the credentials to this URL. These are stored in an asset in orchestrator. And we also have the logf business process name, that is basically the name this process will have in the log messages. Okay, moving on to the constants tab, we have some configurations that are related to the execution of the workflow. For example, we have here the max retry number, that is basically the maximum retry number of times every transaction will be retried in case of an error. So by default it comes as 0, and it must be 0 if we are working with orchestrator queues, but if we are using an Excel spreadsheet or any other storage, we can put another value that is greater than 0. Okay, we also have the screenshots folder path, because in the REFramework, when an error is detected, the workflow takes a screenshot of the point it is detected. And so this here is the path to the folder where the screenshots will be saved. And we also have here some log messages that are some custom log messages. We can customize them, but it's optional. We can leave them as it is by default. And the last one is the assets tab. This tab is used to hold every asset that will be used throughout the workflow, with the exception of credential assets. These credential assets should be put here in the settings tab. But other than that, every asset should be put here. In our case of this exercise, we don't have any, so we'll just leave it empty. Okay, I will close it. And now I will start talking about the initialization state. This state is where all settings and applications are effectively initialized. So if this is the first run of this state, we have a workflow that init all settings. This workflow basically gets the config file and then transform it into a dictionary to be used in every invoked workflow along the project. So after this dictionary is made, we then get the kill all process workflow. This workflow here kills all applications that will be used in the processing, so that it guarantees that none of them are open in the first run of the application, guaranteeing that is a fresh start, a clean start. And after that, we have effectively the invoke init all applications workflow. So in our case, we will be opening Google Chrome to access the Acme One website and so on. This must be configured manually. Alright, after the state, we go to the get transaction data state. This state basically gets the transaction data to be used in the next state. So here in our case, I will open this workflow, the get transaction data workflow, and what it does is basically check in the Acme One website if there is another page to be processed. Basically that, and if there is another page to be processed, we go here to the process transaction state, and if we don't, we just end the process here in the final state. I will go now to the process transaction, and here in our workflow, this one is very simple. It's the process workflow. It is basically getting the information in that page, putting it into a data table, sorry. Then we filter this data table, and for each row in this data table, we add a queue item to the queue defined in the config spreadsheet. So it will do that for every page until there is no one left, and then the process is ended here in the end process. That is basically a closeout applications workflow. We also have here these two other transitions here, the system exception and the business exception, but I will talk about them in the performer part. So moving on to the performer part. As I said, the performer is in charge of processing every transaction, and this is mostly reflected in the get transaction data and process transaction states. The other ones, the end process and the initialization, are basically the same. So here in the get transaction data, we basically have a simple get transaction item activity, because in the dispatcher we populated the queue with the transactions, and now in the performer we are getting these transactions to be processed. But if, for example, our transactions were stored in an Excel spreadsheet instead, we will have to make some changes to the workflow so that here in the get transaction state we could get each row from the spreadsheet, for example. And after that, we follow the same logic as a dispatcher. If we successfully get a new transaction, we go to the process transaction state, and if we don't, we go to the end process and terminate the execution. And lastly, we have here the process transaction state. This state will accommodate the process logic for every use case. In our case, of the second exercise from the advanced course, we would be getting the information from the transaction item and inputting them in the Acme One website, and after that, follow me with the process logic. And we will be doing this, and after doing this, we would go back here to the get transaction data, and we would keep on this loop until we got no new data, and then we could end the process. Lastly, we have these two transitions here that I mentioned earlier in the dispatcher part, the system exception and the business exception. I will start talking about the system exception, and it basically deals with errors in the applications used throughout the workflow. For example, if the Chrome website froze, we could solve this problem by just restarting the application. So it is basically what the system exception does. The system exception transition does. We go back here to the initialization, we kill the applications used, and then restart it, so that we can have a fresh start once again, and we go back here to the get transaction data. And we also have the business exception transition. This business exception handles business errors, such as information in a wrong format. For example, if some information was supposed to contain only numbers, and the dispatcher puts it in the queue with a letter mixed in, it would generate an error when the application tried to input it into the destination. And it would generate an error that cannot be solved by just restarting the application. So, in these types of error, we just go back here to the get transaction data and move on to the next transaction and put the failed transaction as the status failed. So, that is the end of our demo. Thanks for watching and see you guys next time.